Here. It is an immense honor to welcome you all to a guest lecture session on the topic From Sustainable to Regenerative Travel in a Post-COVID-19 World that is being organized by Amity Institute of Travel and Tourism Kolkata. May I now request Professor Siddharth Nanda sir, the head of the institute, to kindly introduce our esteemed guest for the day.
Thank you, Professor Vandita. Uh, it's an honor to welcome Ms. Megan Epler Wood. She is a thought leader, pioneer, teacher, and consultant on questions of managing sustainable tourism for destinations, business, and civil society. She has led her firm EplerWood International since 2003 to design net positive regional tourism development projects working in over 35 countries with support from the World Bank, IFC, and IDB, etc. Since 2010, her research and teaching with Harvard and Cornell universities vetted a wide range of solutions to help protect destinations using science-based, technology-powered measures together with business development techniques designed to meet local social and public health needs along with economic development goals. She is presently dedicated to helping global industry and governments to leverage tourism while genuinely addressing the tough questions of managing tourism as it scales upward after the historic COVID-19 downturn of 2020. She has written many books and many reports and projects to her credit. One of them being on 2017 book named Sustainable Tourism on a Finite Planet, and a report of 2019 Destinations at Risk: The Invisible Burden of Tourism, which address the gaps in governance, business, and civil society models for meeting the aspirational goals of sustainable tourism worldwide. Her latest 2000 report, A Marshall Plan for Tourism, Can It Be Built?, asks how the post-20 to travel and tourism economics recovery can be financed via blended investment, which focuses on responsible small and medium enterprises and destinations sustainably for the long-term goal. Now I would like to request her to please proceed with the session. Thank you so much. It's an honor to have you with us, ma'am, for today's session. Please
Thank,
carry on. Thank you.
thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be able to do these kinds of lectures with this wonderful technology that enables us to be together from across the world. I'm speaking for you today from the city of Burlington, Vermont, which is about 3 hours from Harvard, where I teach virtually, actually, as part of a program at Harvard Extension, which is there where there's a graduate degree on sustainability, in which we look at all industries, but one of the industries we include in the program is tourism. So a lot of my research has resulted from that particular program, and also from Cornell University, where we have a program that looks at tourism and its natural and cultural assets and how we can maintain those in order to maintain value in the future of our tourism economies. So today I'm going to combine all of those roles to talk to you about the, of course, devastating downturn of the post-COVID or the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we can, some approaches to how we might be able to address that. So let's get going. Let's go to the first slide. So just to do the necessary introduction to what we are presently experiencing, the top slide is from the UNWTO. I've been using that slide for a decade, maybe, in which it is projected as you can see, steady growth rate of tourism up and through 2030. So that was a projection, obviously, and we wanted to look at the different regions of the world, such as Asia and the Pacific, where you can see the yellow line was going to be and has gained up until this year the most market share and has been one of the most rapidly growing tourism regions in the world. Now, if you look below, you'll see the same color scheme. And you'll see, of course, that you're losing the most ground in your region. These are, again, were done by UNWTO a little bit earlier in the pandemic. These estimates keep changing, I have to say. It's not as if this is a firm and final estimate, but it gives you a sense of the rise and fall. Just as things do rise quickly, sometimes they fall quickly. And of course, this is historic. I've been working in the field since about 1980, and I have never seen this, and neither has anyone else. Basically, we've seen some downturns, which you can see in the graph, but nothing that really resembles this. So let's talk about how we might respond. Next slide. So yeah, I'm going to focus on the renewal, the regeneration question. How can we deal with such a historic low? And we are not seeing the end of that low yet. I would say all scholars and medical experts would say that it's going to be another year at least. And many are saying that in terms of returning to the original figures that may have been transpiring by way of numbers of tourists, that it might take several years. But in terms of the regeneration, the kind of reopening of the markets, that's more what I'm going to focus on. It's an incredibly important period of time. And I've been working with the Pacific Asia Travel Association for the last 4 months, I say 5 months perhaps, to study how to drive a renewal in tourism regions in the Asia Pacific region. So that's this is a presentation that I've adapted for you, but I just gave it to I would call it a prestigious audience of development bankers from the Asia Pacific region, just like a week and a half ago, in order to discuss how investment can be driven back into the region and in what form. So let's take a look. Next slide. So the first thing I like to say is that obviously this is a devastating downturn, and we know that many people are going into poverty, and that it will, especially in the travel and tourism economy, drive many people out of our industry. We already know that many people were returning to their home villages or other places throughout Asia because they can't be employed by the tourism economy at this time. So I think we're going to see a great need for what I would call government aid that I am not addressing here. The emergency aid to deal with poverty is something that I have to mention, but it doesn't have as much to do with how we unfreeze the market and when we work to achieve that. So one of the things that we've been looking at even before this pandemic is how at Harvard, they're very into this idea of a new type of capitalism that can result in taking into account, of course, the social necessities of people around the world, the economic necessities, and new forms of governance, or ESG. And you may surely already know that these ESG approaches have actually resulted in all forms of new types of investment in the mainstream equity markets. In fact, I just reviewed this yesterday. Most of the ESG screens at the moment, and we're talking, a large proportion of equity investments and even mainstream pension investments around the world, are outperforming the mainstream markets. And this is something that's shocking even the people like me that have been advocating this for, like decades, to see that finally this is becoming mainstream. So part of this presentation is not only about, of course, how do we bring our tourism businesses back into play, but how do we get the investment we need to do it? The two things are really interrelated, and we'll never see an opportunity like this to try and shape the creativity and innovation for you young people in the world that could lead to a different type of regeneration. So let's take a look at that. Next slide. So just briefly, the first piece I wrote, really just sequestered in my own office back in April and March, or I guess March, it's hard to believe, when everyone was first, quarantining here, was this piece. And I was honestly just in a fever about it. And I wrote this, in like one day. And I really believe I was one of the first people to write something like this, and the Marshall Plan, for those of you that don't know, especially in Europe, it was already being referenced, was a major bailout post-World War II of the European economy from the American economy, which was untouched by well, it was touched by the war, but we didn't have war zone devastation, and therefore our very inspired economists and military leaders and also just government leaders at the time invested in Europe to help them rebuild. And that resulted in one of the most sustained post-war time rises of the global economy at that time that has still ever, I don't think it's ever been matched. So it's very important to think in these terms because these are large problems we're facing and we can't really address them with small answers. So we have to think investment. We have to think about where that investment is going to come from because obviously within the tourism economy, it's not going to be that easy. Most of our tourism businesses aren't doing that well. So we have to think, well, okay, and where are we going to invest and how do we want to invest? Okay, next slide. So why now? It was certainly driven home to me by my colleagues in Asia that we need to talk about the existing model that has driven destinations to the brink. This sort of low, and I lectured in India not that long ago in New Delhi for the Responsible Travel Tourism Summit after my book came out. So I don't have photos of the exact sites in India, but I know these are very similar problems from all the presentations I saw. This is Phi Phi Island in Thailand, and what happened was a very rapid rise of tourism over the last 10 years that led to, from the left-hand slide to the right-hand slide, essentially you've got a real problem when you can't manage a site when too many people are arriving pretty much ungoverned too quickly. And Phi Phi Island, apparently, you can see how beautiful it is, started to smell. I mean, there was so much garbage and so much sewage that was going untreated. So this is part of a larger problem with the rapid growth of tourism that we have to address with any kind of ESG style investment. All right, let's keep going. Next slide. So for your reference, and as it was said in my introduction, after I wrote my book in 2017, I was requested by the Travel Foundation to do a follow-up report that they financed and that became called The Invisible Burden of Tourism. And that document is free to download, and it makes the case for a new system of destination management, like for Phi Phi Island or for many places in India. We're going to need a better way of managing our tourism numbers as we regrow. And you see this checklist here that we've created at Harvard for some of the areas that you will need to be considered. So I won't go into that kind of detail today. I have a whole other lecture on this topic, but it's easy to get the document. So I encourage you, if you want to pursue this further, to have a look. Okay, next slide. But I do want to just reinforce how valuable the destinations are. And if we degrade them further, how that will drive our entire tourism economy, not only back to the brink, but permanently undervalue it. We all, of course, many of you may have even been to Bali. I've been there. It's a wonderful location. It's a water-rich island. But about 5 years ago, this local foundation started doing reports where I got this map that shows without question that tourism in these areas that are circled is resulting in excessive exploitation of groundwater that is actually caused by the tourism economy. Now, that may seem like, well, it could be addressed in some ways, such as, say, desalinization. But actually, there's an animated, if you would hit the next slide button, you'll see one more point here. Vandita, thank you. That it will be a permanent problem in this case. Once you have salt water go into a freshwater aquifer, you can't recover it. And so for this foundation, which was representing farmers and others that are living on the island, right, that is a permanent problem for them, for their farming. And also from a point of view of business value, it will start to erode the value of Bali as a destination. So these are serious issues we're talking about in terms of what are the underlying assets upon which tourism is depending on. Okay, next slide. So how do we address this? And at Cornell, actually, we did a roundtable that led to some of these graphics. What we found was that tourism uses these vital resources, such as water, and yet there's no accounting at the local level, at the destination level, how much each of those tourists are costing the destination. Now, obviously, the private sector is accounting for, whatever cost it is to them to manage the tourists coming and going from the destination. That's not the issue here. But the real issue is that we never accounted for the cost per tourist at the local level. So just hit the next button, Vandita, and you'll see another point there. So what we did in my program at Harvard, we've been looking at this since about 8 years now, and many of my students have studied this. And one of my most outstanding students had covered this problem in Greece, where she is from, and found, for example, in the famous island of Santorini, and in Crete and in Rhodes, that they were getting to the point where they couldn't deliver water to the tourists. And in the case of Greece, they had to use large tankers to bring the water to the islands during the dry season, which is exactly when, of course, they don't have enough water on the island, or the famous Cyclades islands of Greece, but they have the most tourists. And so she was driven and has been the lead author of this new Harvard Destination and Resource Monitoring Framework. We tested it in the Mediterranean on an island called Jerba, and we're publishing now the results, and we intend to offer this in the marketplace sometime next year so that destinations, and we're going to be looking for a private sector partner on this actually, because destinations in future, in order to prevent what happened in Bali, for example, will have to know how much water is a tourist using, how much our water, say you want to increase tourism every year. See, our ministries of tourism are saying how many more tourists they want on an annual basis. That's their role in the policy. But no one is saying, well, how much additional water are we going to need? And what is that going to cost? So this is the new type of accounting that we're discussing. Next slide. So in addition, we have a governance problem, and it's not just in India, it's everywhere. In fact, it's probably, I would say, in my work, the least discussed problem that we have in our field. And that is that our destination marketing organizations and our ministries of tourism are really not connected to the management of the impact on local resources on the ground. So as I said, they set out their goals and objectives via marketing goals, via marketing research. I'm sure you've seen all of the campaigns that India has done and how successful they've been. But that doesn't relate, and nor is it their responsibility to come to a better and measured approach or governance approach to managing that demand on the ground. And I'm sure many of you may have seen that. I will only bring it up once. We all know about the Taj Mahal's problems. And some of this is very much related to that. The local municipalities and the historic monuments, and also, of course, resort areas throughout India are affected by this in every way. Okay, next slide. So efforts to measure those impacts, you would think had been going on for a long time, but they really, it's just because neither the municipalities or the national government are actually in charge of this problem, no one is measuring it. So when I started at Harvard, I've just been assigning my students to an annual assignment that I do with my, between 20 and 50 students a year, that they look at one particular issue It can be in the private sector or the public sector. But what we found is that, since my students live all over the world, that they could find, hundreds of examples now of where the environmental impacts of tourism remain completely unaccounted for. And, if we don't know what's happening on the ground, we can't address it. So we're saying that basically on a global basis, a portion of the cost for managing tourists has been completely left out of the equation. And that is why, unlike a private sector situation, these are public-private situations. And so therefore, the public side is left without the financial, or I would say skill base, to manage the issue. Okay, next slide. So that's where we now go back to the question, perfect, yeah, that's great, of targeted investment. Obviously, we've got a big program of investment that we need, and some of this will really relate to small cities. The more that we look at this is Halong Bay on the left, which is another very rapidly growing destination that has had some serious problems in their destination. Because of all of the boats coming in so quickly and the rapid rise of tourists in the area. So what we just discussed in the forum I mentioned, which was based in Bangkok, that these models will have to look at, how to invest not just in the tourism economy itself, but in small. All right. Somebody needs to mute. There we go. Very good. So, so what we want to achieve here is investment towards innovation. One thing that's appealing about the tourism economy is that it drives economic well-being. It has very, very deep capacities to drive economics, not just through tourism, but through the entire local agricultural economy, if properly managed. And it can also drive economic transitions, such as what I'm picturing here, to manage, say, a transition to solar energy, waste and wastewater management, and ultimately bringing more sophisticated smart planning to small cities. And what we were told by the bankers and investment bankers and development bankers in the Asia Pacific region is that they are receiving an unprecedented demand for this kind of, what I would call regional investment in these kinds of services throughout the Asia Pacific region. Now, I don't have the data on that for India, but I do know that they were looking at all of Southeast Asia for small city investment in this kind of transition. So the ability to combine that with the investment in destinations of the future for tourism seems to be one of our models that might have some real traction. So next slide. So, but back to the governance, we have to remember that these local destination, you went backwards. Next, yeah. So that the next stage would be to also figure out how to combine the forces and create a new type of model that helps not only understand future demand on your left and designing services to meet market trends, which is what our destination management organizations do, but match that, you can see on the right, with what we're calling local asset management, managing stakeholder input and local citizen needs, and monitoring consumption of resources and the requirement for infrastructure use. So at Harvard and Cornell, we're really trying to drive home the point that we're going to have to redesign during this period to actually create the right types of entities that can manage both sides of this equation. Next slide. So just to talk about with you students, Uh, I'm not sure how much you're studying environment versus business, but either way, it's important for you to know what types of measurements you're going to need in order to move this forward and this concept forward. And as I mentioned, it very much deals not just with your, your beautiful environmental resources and your vital ecosystems, but your small historic city centers and your cultural monuments, which in India you have in abundance, and the ability to manage those with more sophisticated data systems is what we are suggesting. And then, of course, the socio-cultural systems are still the biggest challenge. It's very important, but it's a little bit less scientific, although obviously the sociological programs in our universities around the world are very sophisticated at surveying how to maintain culture. Tying that into what I would call automated management is more difficult. While much of this, actually surprisingly, what we're seeing is that a lot of this data could actually be done with sensors, so that it wouldn't be people out there just, with their microscopes and their little, materials to sample water. We could actually automate a lot of this material, except for the sociocultural systems. So what we're looking for, what do we need to know, of course, is we're moving beyond what we're, in the past, most reporting of this nature was incremental. It was like, can we do better than we did last year? All right. But now what we need to know is, where is the tipping point, such as with the climate agreement, and how can we avoid reaching that? Because if we have a tipping point, where I said in Bali, where you're destroying the water upon which the tourism economy depends, then you're going to ultimately destroy the resource that you're depending on to manage tourism. So those are critical tipping points, and this is the new phase of monitoring that will be required. We will require local participation, and that is something that we have been really promoting a lot. I'll mention more, which is how to manage that through more sophisticated systems. And then in all forms of science-based monitoring, you have to set a baseline, look at your tipping point, and then try to avoid reaching that tipping point with regular monitoring. So that's how it works. All right, next slide. So how do you actually manage some of the input that I mentioned, the public participation? Well, our program at Harvard has been working with these experts on visualizing data. And so I'm just giving you two examples here. There would be more than this to monitor. But two of our most important reports and crises in the world right now relate to these two topics, right? If you're following the global news, you know that everyone is experiencing more and more impacts from climate change. And the biggest report since 10 years ago, the 2020 report now on our biodiversity losses, is equally serious. And so from the point of view of how India builds out its tourism economy in, say, a coastal area like this in future, what we're saying is that you want to take those data sets that are gathered at the local area and put them into maps. And then, okay, we got hit the button again. We have one more point here, I think, on the slide. And yes, so what we need is that you take this visualized data by putting it into maps and allow local people to see it and understand what's happening. On this slide, the red zones are the zones that are going to be endangered by sea level rise, highest vulnerability. So, the question is that what you want to have in your future? Is an increasingly endangered economy that is right in the target zone for sea level rise. And when you visualize that so that people can see the estimates, it changes their viewpoints on what they might want to see for their future. So we teach this as a course at Harvard, how to do this in the spring every year, and it is open enrollment. Okay, next slide. So how do we even start out? I mean, if you ever wanted to run a project like this, what do you need to think about? Well, the first thing is you're really going to have some clear objectives. If you want to bring in sustainable finance, they're not going to go for business as usual. And as I was just saying, with these ESG screens, they're not going to just jump in on the standard, let's build 10 new hotels right in a climate impact zone. I mean, now, you're still potentially going to be able to find financing for that. I'm not saying it's disappearing, but on the other hand, a growing percentage, and I've heard numerous reports on this, are going to start using climate screens before they finance new projects. So how do you want to, if you want to go this direction and you want to start, building the hotels of the future, what do you want to look at? Well, first of all, you might want to look at how much people are paying per unit. In other words, try and bring in a value add, because that, instead of trying to make it, the cheapest possible, will give you that added amount per tourist to invest in sustainability. You're going to need to work on the protection of these natural and cultural assets. If your asset, say, okay, the Taj Mahal is so overrun, I mean, I know everyone still wants to go there, but if it becomes a bad experience for people, which I've looked at the data on that, the actual consumer data coming out of the Taj Mahal is very negative. So in other words, you want to try and arrest that process and protect these areas, reduce the number of people that are coming, use permits, all this type of thing in order to make it more of a special experience. And then, of course, you have to make sure that you have a climate friendly and resilient project, or you won't be financed. You want to look at what are the social benefits in this ESG screen, right? So local people have to be you have to show mathematically how you are going to make local people beneficiaries in this transition. And you have to create measured platforms, such as the mapping platforms I demonstrated, or some form of dedicated screening process, not just a once and done process, but as I mentioned, a monitoring process that is ongoing in order to get this kind of finance. Okay, next slide. So, of course, there's a lot of mechanics here, but in the end, you also just really need to think about the beauty of this, the wonders of actually potentially pursuing this for your own futures. I'm speaking to you for this reason. You're young people. I want to inspire you. I want you to believe that this is possible. You may be skeptical, and I'm happy to hear your questions. But if you don't believe in it, you won't achieve it. But it is possible to create destinations that will earn just as much as what we have now with fewer tourists. Because the market will be willing to pay more if you, and it's absolutely, I've been talking about this for decades. If you protect the area, you protect the value, and that has been proven. All right, next, I think there's one more point on this slide. So yeah, if we don't do this, we risk going back to the way it was before, or I mean, very possibly worse. So that's why I'm trying to really inspire folks around the world to not think small here, because we're in a historic downturn. And so we need a pretty concerted set of very dedicated folks to advocate for this as a way of getting, say, even government investment in the future of your country, and certainly international investment as well. Okay, next slide. So one other thing that, my team is at EplerWood International is advocating in our reports for the Pacific Asia region, which was validated in our conference with all of the bankers last week, is to use what are called destination hotspots. Now, this is a brand new methodology. It was designed for the regeneration post-pandemic. And what we want to look at is destination cities for the recovery investment with a high rate of influence on national GDP, strong potential for recovery, and natural and cultural capital that is essential to its tourism products. And island nations, which are driven by tourism, have a strong tourism market and future ability to manage climate change impacts are just, this is very much of an overview that, we have tons of spreadsheets on this. But the process for selecting those, it has not begun. I mean, this is absolutely brand new, but this, I just spoke with the Latin American banks yesterday too. They also agree with this, that the recovery money has to go in this direction. Okay. Next slide. So the other finance mechanisms that are important to consider here as you look into your future are certainly the fiscal recovery infusions from your own country, which, as an international expert, I can't influence that much, but you can. But then on an international basis, these other areas are very important. I'm really closely looking at private equity impact funding because that's something I can really influence. It's the most influenceable, and it is where I can do the most myself, okay? And then some of these, I've studied green climate finance and green bonds very closely. They're very complex mechanisms and they have never worked in tourism destinations ever. Okay, and when I was working in the Mediterranean, I was working for the German government, and I actually thought that I could get financing for the island, Jerba Island, and we couldn't get it. The reason is that the mechanisms presently set up are not set up for tourism destinations. But new reports coming out from UNDP are saying that, in fact, we've got a next generation coming of finance that would help potentially the destination focus, small cities. They will start looking soon at small cities. Well, I think that might be a good opportunity. Reallocation of tax funds is a whole other topic. I did have that discussion yesterday with the Inter-American Development Bank. They agree. I was so happy. I've never heard that at a banking level. Also, when I was speaking in Bangkok, they agree. We have to start looking at charging less for marketing tourism or charging the tourist, but allocating a portion of that money away from marketing. It's the only way that and it is worth more than, it's worth billions worldwide. The reallocation of tax funds has started to happen in the Mediterranean, in New Zealand, in Iceland, and in the Mediterranean alone, they raised hundreds of millions of dollars by reallocating tax so that they can reinvest it in the destination. So that's one way we could secure finance at the local level if there was a reallocation program happening, because that will attract other finance. And those could be put into trust funds, which would be independently managed from government. And there are opportunities. Belize is the country that I've worked in where they did this 20 years ago. It's been very successful. They've taken all of the cruise money and put it into trust funds so that they can then reinvest in their country. So those are some of the mechanisms we're looking at. Next slide. So the game plan, just to review, is to review policy mechanisms for developing your sustainable tourism destination. You're going to have a big challenge there, but it's very important. You have to understand what they are. When I was in India, I discussed this with West Bengal and a few other locations by way of their policies, which are not ready for this, but in most places, no place really is. So the question will be how and when could they consider this, especially at this time, because this is the moment when they might consider a change. You have to have the objectives and goals I've just laid out. You have to have your measurement system in place that I discussed. And of course, you're going to need that local skill set. And I do want to mention that I'm in charge of now the global training program for the new destination managers of the future. My company was hired by the UNWTO to develop the first ever certificate on sustainable destination management. It won't be available until next year, but it will be highly affordable. a certificate will be just 250 euros. So that will be managed through Madrid, where they're located, as part of their larger UNWTO Academy of the Future. So for future training, it's coming. And then goals and regional finance institutions, they're going to be critical. Don't ignore those local finance institutions, because they're looking at this. They're all pretty confused themselves about how to help you. So that's why what we're being told is that we have to help them structure this. Literally, they want to help, but they're a little, inexperienced with doing this as well. And that's why I'm talking about this so much. And so then you have to have this strategy, which I've already outlined, with the goals for transition to sustainable destination economies. They're behind it. They'd love to see it, but structuring it locally will be, the next task. Okay, next slide. So again, just to wrap up, the time is now to factor in these key sustainability transition costs. This is a picture of mine from Honduras. It was a road to a brand new airport, and they didn't put in the proper infrastructure to deal with, the sort of rapid types of, I know you've seen this in India too, during the monsoon. Suddenly you're getting these enormously powerful rainfall. I know you've always had it, but it's worse now, and that has to be accounted for as a additional cost to secure your infrastructure. If you're going to put it in, you don't want it to be knocked out immediately. So we have to have this climate resilience in order to proceed. Next slide. And on the front of how to organize, I go back to the destination hub. We really believe, and we have more models available, that this can lead to innovation. It can lead to the application of integrated data systems. It'll help you to develop locally in teams with different types of skills that will enable you to work with both government and the private sector. And it will help you critically right now to develop these finance pipelines. Without structuring those, the money won't arrive, period. And then to coordinate among yourselves. Okay, so that's my presentation. The next slide is a thank you. That's my affiliations and my email address. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, ma'am, thank you so much. That was a really informative presentation. We talk about and teach about tourism, the impacts of tourism. There are so many things which are happening at the destination that we are not aware of. And as you have rightly said, that until and unless we know what is happening, we cannot really measure it. So, I mean, this was a really eye-opening session for all of us, we faculties as well as the students. We have some questions from the end of the students. So I'll just read them out for you, ma'am. Is regenerative tourism a part and parcel of responsible tourism, or is its scope much more bigger?
No, it's part of responsible tourism, absolutely. Those definitions that you've probably been studying vary a little between, say, responsible and eco, but I tend to use the term personally, sustainable tourism. It's not that different from responsible tourism, and so I think the definition is less important than the specific goals that you set out.
And I mean, regenerative tourism has also called as the natural maturation of sustainability. So someone is asking this question, that what would it exactly take to move from a sustainable approach to a regenerative approach?
Okay, well, I like the term. That must be coming out of India. Region ready is not a term that I've been using, but I think I understand it. And I would say that it has to do with regional planning. That's something that we've all looked at, that tourism is not like other industries. in that, you have a factory that's in one place and produces a product, right? And instead, it is a region which provides a variety of goods and services. And so the ability to plan is more in the field of regional planning, but it would be sustainable regional planning with the types of metrics, as I described, that would enable people to understand what they want in one place. The benefit of doing this mapping is that you don't want to, like, say, wipe out all your farming areas because you put hotels there or whatever. So it kind of allows everyone to, like, play with the region and look at what they want from that region as a group.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There is also a question which is asking that if we think of attempting to redesign as well as renaturalize our tourist destinations, especially urban tourism destinations, so what would it take for us to be successful in that?
In the urban areas? That's a great question. Yeah, I've heard that and there's a lot of potential with what they call green infrastructure, which that may be an American term. It's in my book, and I did, run it down. And what what it essentially goes back to is what I would call the urban park movement, but it's expanded the just basic park areas into also areas, say, for small scale farming, or other things that, or even what they call, areas for runoff, which are sort of rain gardens, this type of thing. So it's a variety of types of infrastructure that will make the area more resilient, right? But also better for local people to live there. For example, it can reduce how hot the places are by putting more green in there. And then it also makes it more attractive to tourists, because it allows them places to travel through these cities that are pleasant and not too hot and too overcrowded, right? So it has so many benefits.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We shall be taking one last question. Since regenerative travel has already been termed as the post-pandemic solution that our planet would really need, so one of the attendees there, he is asking, how as a tourist can we practice regenerative travel?
As a tourist. Well, yeah, we were just discussing that with my students last night. Because of the problem of flying, we did our aviation discussion last night. And as you know, flying is an increasing problem by way of how do you manage that sustainably. So one of the, big countries like India and my country, China, we have a lot of flying in order to travel, right? Even domestically. But what our discussion about that is less region focused and more, how does the tourist decide what to do? How often do they travel? And I think that could be fundamental to regenerative tourism. Longer trips and using more, in India you have a great train system, so using more ground transportation and less flying. I think that if of all the moves that any one individual tourist could make, and we had a world expert on aviation on last night, it is flying less. We all have to think about flying less.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I really thank you once again for being with us here today, and for your I would say powerful inputs. And it has been a really enlightening and inspiring session for us all. And we would really look forward to some event again in the future where we would like to invite you to be a part of our event. So thanks once again.
All right, well, thank you for having me, and good luck to everyone.
Thank you so much.